sometimes it's what we can't see, things that lie under the surface that are the most dangerous. Take a deep breath. And what do you notice?
Sometimes you don't see an injury that's happening to a person on the outside, but it's just so much going on the inside. I'm going to tell my story in as many words as I can remember, because sometimes I have a little trouble with keeping it in a chronological order.
After 22 years, Tahita Jabbar is still struggling with the long-term effects of injuries received from her abuser.
There's really something going on. I'm feeling it's almost like I'm being taken back to when this first happened. I'm feeling the fuzziness in my ears, and I'm feeling the vision is blurry. There's something going on.
Tahita is a survivor of a traumatic brain injury brought on by beatings from her ex-husband.
And so that day when he beat me upside the head, I left the children outside, and when he finally was done with the beating, I just crawled up the stairs and went and got in my bed. And I'm sure it must have been 2 days that I just had to lay still. And I couldn't go to the emergency room. Number one, I didn't have insurance. And I couldn't go to the emergency room, number two, because he wouldn't have allowed it.
Domestic violence continues to be an epidemic in our society. 1 out of every 4 women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. Domestic violence beatings can lead to traumatic brain injuries, injuries that can impair cognitive functions.
A traumatic brain injury is a blow, jolt, or penetrating injury to the head that interrupts normal brain function.
Such injuries can lead to severe problems, such as memory loss, early signs of dementia, even loss of life.
More than 100 people die every year as the result of domestic violence in Arizona.
There is no doubt that domestic violence is dangerous. Law enforcement is working with the community to end domestic violence and make the community safer. In particular, traumatic brain injuries are a concern to us.
Survivors of domestic violence face a difficult and confusing time, which can be made more difficult by the presence of a traumatic brain injury.
Traumatic brain injury has been linked to domestic violence. Blows to the head, a bullet from a gun, shaking someone violently, even strangulation are just some of the causes of traumatic brain injury inflicted by an abuser.
And he grabbed me by my hair. He threw me upside the wall, and then he pulled me back by my hair, and he started beating me in the head with his fists. And I tried to muffle my screams, but he was hitting me so hard, I started screaming. So the children ran up to the door, and I'm telling them, go away, you all go play. And I tried to kick the door shut so that it would be muffled and they couldn't hear what he was doing.
A traumatic brain injury impacts a person's ability to function in 3 major ways: physical, cognitive, and emotional behavioral. From a mild traumatic brain injury and concussion standpoint, the most common physical symptoms are going to be headaches, dizziness, and balance-related issues. From an emotional behavioral perspective, the most common issues are going to be related to increased depression and anxiety. And from a cognitive perspective, which I think is the most important perspective to talk about specifically with this population, is memory, attention, concentration, and speed of processing.
This extremely violent abuse can have far-reaching and long-range effects. Some of the injuries are readily apparent. Others are buried under the surface, hidden but still dangerous and debilitating to victims.
Unfortunately, traumatic brain injury can't always be seen outwardly. So it's not like somebody's wearing a Band-Aid on their forehead that says, "Pardon me, I'm forgetful, I've had a traumatic brain injury." So it's really important to just stay mindful that this is a significant issue that impacts individuals with domestic violence. And when interviewing or interacting, it's, again, just important to kind of keep it in the back of your mind that traumatic brain injury may be something that impacts their ability to function.
It gets frightening. It's fearful when you can't remember, you can't, you forget things, and you know that this is something that's not of your nature.
Domestic violence and traumatic brain injury affect every community, and it's important to work together to end both.
The Maricopa Association of Governments Regional Domestic Violence Council is made up of law enforcement, prosecutors, victim advocates, and elected officials. It is their mission to work collaboratively to end domestic violence in the region. The council has worked to develop a list of recommended police practices or protocols that can be adopted by law enforcement.
Domestic violence is being addressed by police officers in taking up the protocol model, utilizing it within their departments, which gives some consistency across the region in how domestic violence victims and offenders are treated.
Domestic violence investigations are complicated, and the presence of a traumatic brain injury can make communication with the victim more difficult.
When law enforcement interacts with victims of domestic violence, they need to be prepared for a traumatic response. Victims may appear escalated, agitated, and non-cooperative. They may have difficulty creating a chronological timeline of the event. With traumatic brain injury, the difficulty to create that timeline may be more apparent.
When the officers arrive on the scene, that because of what I went through, I was vulnerable, I was emotional, I was in pain, I was embarrassed, I was scared for my children's welfare. So I think that the officers have to be a little bit more aware of the story that she's telling you may not jive with what the chronological order that you feel that it should be, that this story should take place in. But that's what happens when people have traumatic brain injury.
By better understanding TBI, or traumatic brain injury, a law enforcement officer has a better idea of what they're looking at when they respond to a domestic violence.
Things like difficulty with memory and their attention and their concentration, and especially when it comes to being a historian or being compliant. Cognition is going to be something that impacts that person's ability to perform in that environment. So it's important to be mindful of not only the emotional component of being a victim, but also the cognitive end of things as a result of their traumatic brain injury, from being able to answer questions to being able to follow directions.
So officers need to exercise a lot of patience. Officers need to be understanding. They need to demonstrate a kind, caring, and compassionate type of attitude, and make sure that they're aware of possible issues or concerns that may be going on with that victim, that maybe they struggle with understanding at the time, but if they slow down a little bit and give the person enough time to communicate and look for certain signs and symptoms that may be an indication of some additional injuries, I believe that would be a great assistance to officers in completing these types of investigations.
One tool officers use to better communicate with victims are lethality assessments. Lethality assessments involve a list of questions used by police or victim advocates to identify victims who are at greatest risk of being killed.
A lethality assessment is something that gives the officers and the investigators a better understanding of the possible history that's involved in domestic violence type situations or the potential of future violence. Looking at the history of lethality assessments that have been conducted by law enforcement agencies, it has proven to be a very productive and useful tool for law enforcement agencies.
It's being used by prosecutors in a consistent manner, which also allows for that same treatment throughout the region.
One of the things that we're really proactive on, and that is training our officers to be able to identify certain signs and symptoms that domestic violence victims may be going through, and then use that as an assessment for their follow-up investigation and information that will be forwarded to the investigating detectives to further assist them with completing the investigation.
Lethality assessments can reduce repeat domestic violence calls to the same household, increase safety for law enforcement and victims, help prosecutors when charging offenders, and offer hope for preventing domestic violence fatalities in the future. Conducting a lethality assessment and taking the time to listen are two very important tools officers can use on the scene.
There has to be a follow-through, there has to be a follow-up, and there has to be sensitivity, and there has to be, officers have to be aware of the emotions that the traumatic emotions that this person is going through. I think that you do have to be more sensitive when you come into a situation of domestic violence with a brain injury or a head injury than any other situation that you come into, because I couldn't think, I couldn't feel, I couldn't remember, I couldn't see. And I believe that that's true for most people who are going through that kind of a situation.
Probably the most important thing is to put yourselves in the shoes of the family that is dealing with the domestic violence. Only then can you really fully understand what they're going through.
Besides conducting lethality assessments, officers can go one step further. They can connect victims with advocates. The advocates play a critical role in following up with victims of traumatic brain injury to make sure they are getting the help they need.
There are many great resources available to victims of domestic violence, and police can be a great asset in helping victims to connect to these resources.
There are also many services available for survivors, such as counseling, shelters, hotlines, and support groups.
Take a deep breath.
Mike Hutt works at Chrysalis, a domestic violence shelter. Its mission is to transform lives by giving survivors the tools they need to succeed and feel safe. Hutt works with survivors using a therapy called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR.
So the light bar is used in EMDR, and it's one of many forms and ways to treat trauma. We ask the clients to think about the traumatic memory that's very distressing to them, causing them current difficulties. And when they think about it and track the lights, they begin to integrate pieces of their memory and discharge some of that emotion. It feels less distressing for them. So that way they could function and live a more free life from their trauma.
Tahita is a survivor, and although she is still being treated for the beating she received 22 years ago, she has made great strides physically and emotionally. Today, she is giving back to the domestic violence community with her own organization, SWAN, which stands for Someone Worth Accepting Now. It helps survivors get back on track with their lives and regain self-esteem.
That there is life after someone treating you like dirt. And finally, I can work with other people who feel that way and let them know that you are not dirt. It doesn't have to be that way. You can do, if I can do it with my 9 children, you can do it with what you have. And that's one of the biggest boosts. So ego, I mean, it's just great, just great.
If you are a victim and you feel you are in danger, please call 911 or the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. For a map of local victim services, go to www.finddvservices.com. Everyone plays a role in ending domestic violence.
Domestic violence is a problem that affects all societies, all walks of life, rich, poor, it doesn't matter. Our job as a society, as a council, is to end domestic violence